Your busy day. I apologize. I did not realize it was Palm Sunday when I planned this a couple months ago. Thank you for coming again. My name is Rene Mertens, if you were not familiar with me already. And today I would like to have another presentation, more of an updated presentation on some of the changes and shifts that are happening in education. It's being sponsored today by two groups, New Yorkers United for Kids. We represent political action for the children of New York State. Somebody needs to make a stand for them. Our children only have one childhood and it's being stolen from them. If you would like more information, there is a bookmark. Also on the back, there's a sticker. I've been blessed with a blog, so I blog from time to time. I don't usually blog on the regular, on a weekly basis, so just be aware of that if you would like to take a peek at that. But at this point, I'd just like to do a stand for a pledge to the flag. Do we have any veterans represented here? Would you please lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Also, Earl, would you come up and do a benediction for us, please?
All right, we're going to pray. I know my pagan sister here may not have remembered that this was Palm Sunday, but she did ask me to pray. I want to say a few words about prayer in the Bible before we begin. I'm not going to take much time. You know, our inalienable rights are embedded in the Ten Commandments. And the Founding Fathers realized this, and they embedded the Ten Commandments in the Bill of Rights. For instance, when God says, "Thou shalt not murder," he's saying every person has a right not to be murdered. Every person has a right not to be stolen from and lied to. And our challenge is everywhere I go in the world, I wrote a book called The Three-Dimensional Leader. I was in Dubai in December, and I'm supposed to go to Vienna this summer, but we'll see if those, anyway, everywhere I go in the world, what levels the playing field with people when they're always struggling with what type of government shall we have? I ask people, do you want your government to treat you according to the Ten Commandments? Do you want your government to murder you? Do you want your government to not lie to you? And people say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so that's our challenge in the United States of America. The people in our government have decided to lie to us. They've decided to manipulate us by giving programs positive sounding names like Common Core, and they do the actual opposite with it. It's Common Core, it should be called Common Corruption. And they lie to us about basic scientific facts. They're lying to us about efficient mathematical processes. But that's my shtick. I want government to get back to treating us treating us according to the Ten Commandments. I want government to acknowledge the inalienable rights that God has given us through them. And there's only a certain type of person that should be elected to government because the rest of them can't be trusted to do that. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for this day. I thank you that Rene has taken the wherewithal to pull us all together. Lord, I pray that you would bless her efforts, that you would give her your encouragement. I thank you for people like Peg Luksik, who has come here today, for Jim Tedesco, other people who have positions of power and influence, Lord, and that you would open our eyes, our hearts, and our ears to your truth. Father, I pray that you would take us who were no people, and that you would draw us unto yourself and make us a people unto you, a people who honor you, who honor your Ten Commandments and understand how to apply them to government and civic affairs. We pray that you would just give us your understanding now of this issue. Speak through Ms. Peg Luksik on our behalf, Father. Enlighten us, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Earl. At this time, I just would like to welcome Assemblyman Jim Tedesco, and I would like to have him just speak to you about some current legislation on education issues that he's personally working on to help the people and the children of New York State. So could you come up, please, Jim? I think we're recording.
For his video.
We're recording.
It'd actually be better to run behind the table and stood in the light.
Can't go much further, Jim. Sorry.
Okay, this is close enough.
I like that prayer. When I was coming over today and driving here, for some reason I started to think about Abraham Lincoln. And if you remember, one of the things he's noted for saying, someone once asked him, do you think God is on the side of the Union? And Abraham Lincoln looked back at the fellow who asked him and said, I'm not concerned at all about whether God is on the side of the Union. What I'm concerned about is the Union is on the side of God, because God is always right. And when you look back at what took place over the last couple of years in our New York State government, with the governor, with the so-called leaders out there, with the majorities in both houses, Republican and Democrat, I never thought about God being on our side, but I know now we were right. We were on God's side. And that is, after a whole year last year of legislators and the governor saying, well, the standards are great and the testing is just fine, what are you talking about? It's the implementation, it's that curriculum. Well, look, what we understand now, after all that rhetoric and after all the debate, when you mandate the standards and you mandate the high-risk testing that took place, the curriculum was going to always be what it was going to be. The holy grail was the testing. And they were going to evaluate the teachers at 50% of their evaluation for being good educators. Now think about it. I just drove out of Schenectady, where there's unbelievable crimes. Somebody just got shot again over there. There's homelessness. There's poverty. Sometimes you can't find the parents of the kids at that school. There's addiction. There's kids with very special needs. All that baggage comes to school with the City of Schenectady School District, and the teachers have to deal with it. I love all the other districts, the high wealth districts out there. I love Shenandoah, Boston Spa, Burn Hills. But that baggage doesn't come out there with those kids. So you're going to tell me that each of those groups of teachers at the high wealth districts and at the impoverished districts are going to be evaluated at the same rate, at 50%, and the kids are going to learn at the same rate too. Kids that they can't even find their parents sometimes. Kids that don't even get to school. It cannot be and should not be the Holy Grail. Now, the reason why I know we were right in saying the tests are too long, they're developmentally inappropriate, and evaluating any teacher, really at any standardized test, with one measurement, 50% is ridiculous. Kids learn in different ways, and they're tested in different ways. So the governor, during the course of this whole thing, and many of my colleagues, unfortunately, didn't support two bills that made imminent sense. The Common Core Parental Refusal Act, which I do have sponsors on both sides of the aisle in the Assembly, and sponsors on both sides of the aisle in the Senate on that. In a bill that says you can't use up to 5% any standardized testing process for evaluating educators. There's got to be a series of measurements you're going to use. You know, any value-added measurement, VAM, knows it's going to fail when it uses one measurement up to 50% for evaluating kids or for evaluating teachers. Those are the two bills that are pending out there. At the end of last year, you saw what happened. First of all, what happened was over 200,000 parents said, I'm going to use my First Amendment rights. I know what's best for my kid, and I'm not going to send my kid to take these tests. We're going to opt out. That is the only reason why the governor at the end of the year said, and this was the unbelievable thing, he had the nerve to walk up and say, Common Core has failed in every single way. He said Common Core was a success in every single way for a whole year until 200 parents, who by the way are voters, said, we're not sending our kids. It's a failure. One of the worst indictments were, in many of my school districts and school districts across the state, they were actually sending home memos. Now, I had a real job before I became an assemblyman. You probably know that. I was an educator for 9 years. I never had to send a memo home to the parents saying, this is how you counsel your kids on the stress of taking a standardized test, because kids were vomiting, they were stabbing themselves with pens and pencils. That was an indictment. And I told the superintendents that, and I told the principals that, and the teachers understood that. Now at this point, the governor said, here's the answer. And Commissioner Elia said, this is the answer. First of all, and the region says this is the answer, and SED says this is the answer. We're going to rebrand it and we're going to rename Common Core. We're going to give it a bright new name. In other words, we're going to take a pig and we're going to put lipstick on it and it's going to be pretty now. Well, after a while, the governor said, no, they're not going to buy that because it's not going to look pretty. It's not going to look any different. So what he said, I have the answer. What my colleagues usually do out there. He's going to form another commission. Now, a commission, you would think, is to get something done. This commission is to not get something done. Is to keep the same thing happening the same way and do what he's calling a delay. We're going to delay these things and we're going to make them better. We're going to make the standards better. We're going to make the testing all right better. And right now, we're not going to use the evaluation to such a high level of 50%. Well, what they're going to do is talk the talk, but not walk the walk. Because for a year, they were saying, we're going to penalize parents, we're going to penalize kids, basically, receivership, we're going to penalize schools, we're going to penalize teachers. All of a sudden, the governor's, oh, we would never penalize anybody for kids not showing up for the test. We won't do that. Yet, when the superintendents came into my office just these past couple weeks, they said, Jim, SED's calling us and said, we could lose funding. I go, what? They just came out with a commission that said there'd be no penalties if people wanted to opt out. Well, you need to pass, I have to tell you, a lot of superintendents and administrators were supporting Common Core. They told me I had to pass the two bills that were pending, the Common Core Refusal Act, because parents will come out more if you don't pass that bill and say they have their First Amendment rights. And the teachers will campaign more if we don't say it's not going to be, cannot be 50%. See, they're talking the talk, but they won't walk the walk. If they were walking the walk, they put in statute those two things, that every single parent has the right to opt their kids out from these tests, and you cannot evaluate teachers at a rate of 50% on their efficacy and effectiveness. But they're not doing that. What they're trying to do is calm the waters, delay what they've done, and say, we've corrected it now, after those opt-outs don't come out, and see how nice the testing goes right now. Because they want to get up to that 95%. The last thing we want to do is let them give 95% of the kids taking this test and get their foot in the door. If we don't pass those two bills, giving parents opt-out or reducing how we evaluate teachers in terms of a percentage of these tests as a holy grail, they're going to get their way. So we have to be mindful of the fact that this is a delaying tactic. It's not what really is going to be in the best interest of our kids, as Rene has said, and I thank her for organizing many of these things. And I thank Dr. Pegg for always being up in front and being so knowledgeable as an educator, way beyond my knowledge of it. Even though I was an educator, she's got some important degrees that I never had, and she'll talk to you about the real inside factor. But I think you should know we have to spread the word until they walk the walk. And just say, well, we're working on these, and we're going to delay it, and we're going to make it right eventually. Well, that's not enough. That's a technique to make it continue the way it is. That's the commission that keeps things going the way it is. So I offer that up to you. If you want to go on the website and look at the Common Core Parental Refusal Act petition, we've got thousands of signatures on that. And every time somebody signs onto that, it sends a memo to the governor, too. So that's why he understands. If he can cut down on those parents who opt out, those are all voters. And he's getting it his way. And if he gets his way, it's not going to be in the best interest of our kids and our educators and our schools.
And Mr. Tedesco, what do we do to get Common Core out of the classroom? Because while they're delaying, our children are still being educated under Common Core.
Well,
they get what they want.
Yeah, it's the law right now. And unless we remove that from its existence and we have people, you know, I debated Assemblywoman Nolan on the floor. And the sad part about that debate was she wouldn't even answer the questions. And then, as you know, I asked the governor to take the 5th grade Common Core test, and I said he wouldn't be as smart as a 5th grader, and he refused to, because he probably would have failed. So, you know, we wish we could do these things, but we have to have the support of a majority. And we don't have that support right now. And really, I've said this before, and it's very sad, follow the money. follow these huge testing companies, which their only incentive is to get as many tests as possible into the school district and make them as relevant, make them the holy grail for evaluating kids and for evaluating teachers. And if you follow their money and who they're donating to, you realize where it's hard to get Common Core out of the schools. And that's why I just tried to put forth a bill called the Spirit of 76, so we can get some ethics bills to the floor that show where the funding is coming from, how Sheldon Silver got all those pockets of money to game the system, and Dean Skellis, who got all that money. Because Preet Bharara is a great federal prosecutor. He said, if you saw something, you should have said something. You know what? Not only did I see something with my colleagues, the media didn't see anything, the public didn't see anything, because it was all hidden when the three men made the deal in the back room. And how you overcome that is, I think, at the ballot box. You got to hold these guys' feet to the fire. Until we take some power back from these powerful, unbridled power from these speakers and have oversight so we can get bills to the floor ourselves, we're going to see the temptation to do the same thing over and over again. Yeah.
One last question. You gonna run for governor?
Let's start the fundraiser. If I can walk out of here with $20 million, I'm ready to go. Thank you for having me very much.
Oh, one more.
Oh, question. As you know, if either one of the two leading contenders in the GOP do attain the presidency, both of them have said they're going to throw Common Core out on day one. But when they do, it's going to go back to the 10th Amendment and states' rights. What do you think New York State is going to do with it?
Well, New York State's going to do what they usually do, and that is
The wrong thing?
the wrong thing probably, because it's controlled by downstate interest. 9.5 million people centralized there. It's a very blue state. And, I mean, look what happened to Mr. King, who was our commissioner of education here. If you ever want to talk about a Peter principle, here's a person who failed miserably, and Barack Obama makes him the Secretary of Education. You can't make that up. That's like, which one of the Menendez brothers do you want to bunk with? You know.
Don't forget he made Kevin Jennings his safe school czar. If you know about that man's background, it's just incredulous.
Yeah. So,
All right, one more question.
okay.
There's an organization that we're going to be meeting with on April 14th, I believe it is. And they're trying to split New York into two different states, upstate being called New Amsterdam. Have you heard about that?
Oh, sure. You know, that's been talked about for a long time. But look, they're never going to separate us. Did you ever get a leech on your body? I don't think I have to say any more about that.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Also, just so that the public knows, there is another bill out there for special education children, and Mike, you might even be able to recall that, for a non-regents pathway.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so just be aware that there are good bills out there, just that we, the people, need to do our civic duties. And this is one of the reasons why we are hosting these forums. So without saying too much more than that, we know we need a full repeal, and in New York State, we're just gonna have to keep on keeping on, and that is debunking the lies that keep filtering down from our federal government through our state governor and the New York State Education Department. But we need to keep the battle going, because when we can break that, we can regain control over education of our kids, and they are indoctrinating them. So I'm not going to be shy about that. It's the truth. So having said that, I'm going to welcome at this time Miss Peg, Dr. Peg Luksik. Little joke there. And Miss Luksik, would you please come up, and I'll let you introduce yourself because you are so elegant.
Will it mess you up if we turn off this light? And just turn on one in the back, if people have light. That way they can see the screen a little bit better. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about me. Thank you for allowing me to come. I do come from Pennsylvania. I am an educator with over 35 years of experience. I've taught everything from preschool through college in pretty much every educational setting that you can imagine, from regular classrooms to alternative education to special ed classrooms, GED programs. I actually have written several books on education. I was an advisor to the Reagan administration. He had a commission on the family, and I was one of the advisors. I worked for the United States Department of Education for several years. My job was to review and evaluate education reform initiatives. So I have a long history. The screen is more important than I am. I'm prettier, it's more important. So look at the screen, not at me. Everything you're going to see is documented so that you will be able to see where I got it from. This presentation is actually available online on my website, which is foundedontruth.com. And so you can see, actually, it is this very same, slightly earlier version of this presentation, but it is available through Founded on Truth. Now, Common Core, or the whole idea of standards, has a long history, but we're not going to be here all day. So we're going to start in 1989. In 1989, President Bush the Elder was in office, and he held an education summit with the National Governors Association. The chairman at the time was a man named Bill Clinton. That summit broke the tradition of local control and started to move to the idea of the federal government setting education goals. When Mr. Clinton got elected president, his legislation was called Goals 2000, and that's when the states started writing all of the standards. Before that, they didn't have them. So when people talk about, well, we've had standards-based education, it has always been a federal mandate. The federal government made the states set the standards from the very beginning. So it's never been state-driven, it's always been federally mandated. Now, when they started this in the 90s, it was called outcome-based education, and there was a huge outpouring of opposition. I know I was one of the leaders in the 1990s. And so Goals 2000 had no teeth. So if states, they had to write the standards, but there was no penalties for how the children would achieve them. That changed with the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act, which was President Bush the Jr.'s signature piece of education legislation. There is really no role for the federal government in education. If you read the Constitution, you won't see the word education appear. The way the feds get around that is they make money available to the states, and they say to the states, do you want this money? You volunteer. If you volunteer for the money, you're volunteering for the mandate. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson was president. It was part of the war on poverty. And the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was first passed. Now, interestingly, it was 32 pages long. The latest version was 1,062. When the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed, it made what was called Title I money available to the states, and there were a number of other pieces involved in it. It was a poverty bill. So the states turned in their poverty figures, and you got money based upon how many children in that district lived below the poverty level through a bunch of measurements. When the federal government gives money, you get this much money for this much time. When the time runs out, either the money goes away, so the program and the mandates go away, or the federal government reauthorizes. They say, we're going to give you more money. And that keeps the program and the mandates going. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act has been reauthorized several times since 1965. The 2001 reauthorization was called No Child Left Behind. That's why sometimes you heard it called No Child Left Behind, and sometimes you heard it called ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, because it was a continuation of the 1965 bill. No Child Left Behind was extremely popular when it was passed, very unpopular by the time that it died. In December of 2015, the federal government created the next authorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was called the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. Now, there's a number of provisions. ESSA is over 1,000 pages long, but we're just going to look at a couple of them, and it involves testing. No Child Left Behind said between grades 3 to 5, you had to take one test. That was all that was federally mandated. The new bill says you have to have a test every year. No Child Left Behind said between grades 6 and 9, one test. The new legislation is 3 tests, one every year. Both are one in high school. So No Child Left Behind, there were actually only 3 mandated tests. But the new bill, there are 7 mandated tests. So the federal testing requirement is bigger in this bill. So when you hear, oh no, it turned all this power back to the states, No, the feds actually tightened up on the requirements of meeting the federal testing. In No Child Left Behind, it said there was a 95% participation rate, but it didn't really mention the whole concept of parental opt-out. The new legislation says in order for the parents to opt out, there has to be a state law authorizing it, which is why bills like Representative Tedesco's is so incredibly important. Because the legislation says you must honor existing state laws. But if you don't have a state law, there's nothing for the feds to honor. At the same time, the legislation says, well, we're going to penalize districts if more than 5% of the parents opt out. I will tell you that will not hold up in court. Because the Supreme Court over and 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 over again has upheld the concept that parents direct the education and upbringing of their children. But right now they're pushing hard on school districts to try to push them into, you must get parents to participate. The federal legislation says the state can lose some administrative money, the districts can lose some flexibility in how they spend the money, but this is a formula grant. It's based on your poverty numbers. There is no provision to take money away from the school districts. So while they'll tell you that that's what they do, they can't, because the legislation doesn't include that language. This says, No Child Left Behind said there was no limits on the amount of testing, so you could go beyond the test. This new legislation says we're going to limit the amount of testing that you can give. So the feds are requiring more tests that the federal government approves, but then putting a cap on the number of tests that a school district can give, which means that the federal tests become the tests. It used to be, well, you can give however many you want. So if you wanted to take an Iowa test or the Stanford test, as well as the state assessment, the district could step outside. But now it's saying we're going to mandate more, but then we're going to put a limit on what you can do. So the ones you give, we have to approve. So it's actually a tightening up of control. No Child Left Behind said you had to have 100% proficiency by 13 years after the bill was passed. This new legislation doesn't say you have to have 100% proficiency, but it does mandate that every district show improvement every year. What happens if you don't? So there's not really a change in terms of the federal government mandating achievement. It's still mandating achievement on the children. Now, since the tests become the holy grail, as Representative Tedesco said and as the legislation says, it's important to know how the tests work. Most of us are used to a raw score when we look at tests. You know, you took a spelling test, you got 8 out of 10 correct, your paper said 8 out of 10 or 80%. A raw score has, you get exactly the number that were in the test and exactly the number that you got right or wrong. There's no extra measurements, so there's no error in that number. You get what you get. But in the test that we take, you don't get that. You get what's called a scaled score, which is where the testing owners, the testing authority, takes the raw data and uses some formulaic construction to turn it into a different set of numbers. You get the different set of numbers, but you never get the raw data. Well, as soon as I start putting a formula in there to turn one set of numbers into another set of numbers, unless it's a straight comparison, you're going to get an error of measurement. So when you look at these tests, it's important to understand what is the error of measurement? Like what do the numbers really mean? The ACT test is one that is often used by states. New York uses it a lot too. This is their technical manual. It's the current technical manual. And they say that their standard error of measurement is 2 points plus or minus. That means if you get a score 30, it really is a score anywhere between 28 and 32, and they're 68% sure of that. So they're pretty sure that 30 is really between 28 and 32, but they're not really sure. They're only 68% sure. That means the score would have to change by more than 2 points up or down before you could consider the number to be different. You know when they talk about presidential elections, and they give you this person's at this percentage in the poll and that person's at that percentage in the poll, and then they say the standard error of measurement is, and if they're within it, they say they're basically the same. Well, that's how these tests go. So when you look at tests like the SAT or the ACT or the NAEP, they're all scaled scores. So for example, the ACT test, you'll get scores high 20s, low 30s. SAT tests, you get 1,200 to 1,600. Those really are the same achievement levels, but the numbers are really different. Because what they did was they changed the numbers, but you don't ever get the raw data. So when you look, for example, I was in West Virginia, and they brought in people from Kentucky to debate me, and the people from Kentucky were saying how wonderfully Kentucky's ACT scores had gone up since they've been implementing Common Core. They went up by 1/10 of a point in a system where the standard error of measurement is plus or minus 2, which means they didn't change at all. So you need to look at what the error of measurement is in these scores, and even that change, as you see from the ACT score, isn't absolute, because they're only sort of short. The next thing you need to know in looking at the test is it valid? You know, we hear that the tests are valid and reliable. Those words are not just words. They mean something. They are very specific terms in the how tests are put together. Validity means a test measures what it says it's going to measure. Every day I get on my bathroom scale. Every morning it says 110. I love my bathroom scale. It's the best bathroom scale on the planet. And then I go to my doctor for my annual checkup, and I stand on that scale, you know, with the real weights, and it doesn't say 110. My bathroom scale was reliable. It said the same number every day and every day and every day. It wasn't valid because it was wrong. Now, you know when your bathroom scale, the batteries die? So you get on it one day, it says 110, you get on the next day and it says 350, and you're pretty sure you didn't gain 240 pounds in one night? It's not reliable. It didn't say the same thing over and over and over again. So testing has to be reliable. Same thing over and over and over again. Valid. It measures what it says it's going to measure accurately. So keep the bathroom scale in your head. So, are these tests valid? No, they are not. When the children come into the testing situation, and Representative Tedesco spoke about this with you a few minutes ago, you don't know if any of those kids are sick. You don't know if one of their dog died last night. You don't know if there's something wrong in their family. You don't know if there was a fire up the street, and so they were up watching the ambulance all night long and the fire engine, so they didn't get enough sleep. You don't know if they had breakfast or dinner. All of those things affect the child's score. But all that happens is they take a test and a score comes back. For any given child, you don't know if you were actually testing math or if you were testing the fact that their dog died last night. In any given large population, for about 10% of the children, you actually are measuring the death of their dog instead of their mathematical ability. However, we know that as the socioeconomic level of the child goes down, the interfering factor rate goes up. Because children who live in poverty are more likely to have poor rest, poor nutrition, and undiagnosed illness, upheaval in their home or in their family. All of that will affect the test scores. Now, is that just my opinion? No, it is not. This is a document, it's called Incentives and Test-Based Accountability. It's by the National Research Council in Washington, D.C. They're part of the National Academies Press, which is a federally funded think tank. They look at all different issues, not just education issues, but they do a lot of research, and they're considered, their research is considered to be valid. They actually are valid and reliable, that they've gone through and they've done a lot of testing. And so they've looked at this situation. And what they said was, policymakers in education know that test scores are uncertain. They change from one occasion to another, even though the child hasn't changed. Sometimes it's how they interact with the questions. You know, every one of us has had the experience where you studied 4 things, and just by chance, those were the 4 things that you got asked on the test. Or you studied 20 things and skipped 4, and the questions were the 4 that you skipped. We've all had that experience. There's a relationship between the test taker and the test. And then there are other interactions, the test taker. And so you shouldn't consider these true scores. You shouldn't consider them the truth. You should consider them an estimate. One measurement among many measurements. But this system does exactly the opposite of that. The NAEP itself, the NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a congressionally mandated test. And their technical manual, and this is right off their website, says you should not interpret NAEP results in a causal sense because things like race or ethnicity, socioeconomic and educational factors impact performance. Yet we're now treating these scores as if somehow they're magically correct. We've always known that they're not. This is not new information. Educational policymakers have always known this. So why are they flying in the face of what they know? You hear that, well, we have this crisis in America because our kids do so poorly on international assessments. This is an article from USA Today. And what they did was they looked at the international student assessment and said, isn't it terrible how America does so poorly? And Finland does so well. Among the children tested in Finland, and we're a country that tests all the children, Finland does not. Most countries do not. Among the children who were tested in Finland, the poverty rate was less than 5%. So researchers at Columbia University went through that same assessment and said, okay, we're only going to take the results for American schools for which the poverty level is less than 20%, which still cuts in the direction of Finland. Not only did we do well, we came out first because the tests are measuring poverty, not achievement. Here in New York, your New York Department of Education actually mapped the connection between test scores and poverty scores. This is English language arts. The red button, the red dots, that's the poverty rate all the way up to 100%. So you can see as the poverty rate gets more dense, the black line is the test results. It's a correlation of almost 35% between poverty and the results of the children on the English language arts test. And your own Department of Education did that research. That's right out of their information. Math, the same. Correlation is 38%, 33%. So a little bit, because math is not as connected to your poverty by a little bit, because math is, you don't necessarily have to have a background in language for your mind to be able to do numbers. But the connection is still more than obvious. Now, this test isn't supposed to be testing poverty. When you have an extraneous factor that is responsible for more than 1/3 of the results, you have a huge problem in this picture. And those numbers come right from your own State Department of Education, which means they know that they're testing poverty. Now, they don't just test poverty. This system punishes it. Why? Because children who don't do well in these tests have their educational progress interrupted. They have to go into additional services, which means they're not moving forward, or they're not taking computer or language or art or music because they're taking additional services. Their teachers can't keep their jobs. So teachers who teach in poorer districts are more likely to lose their jobs because the children are poor. They're replaced with teachers who will also not have children passing the tests, which means the children in the poorest districts who most need experienced teachers are the ones that this system guarantees will have a round robin of inexperienced teachers forever. This system doesn't just test poverty, it punishes it. You hear that these are criterion reference tests. There's 2 ways to score a test. Norm referenced, simplest way, it's grading on the curve. Remember, you hated the kid who got a really high score because it pulled the curve up, and you really loved the kids who did low because it pulled the curve down. That's a norm reference test. How do I do compared to everybody else? Criterion reference test. There's a right answer and a wrong answer. You're graded on your answer. If everybody gets the right answer, everybody gets 100. If everybody gets the wrong answer, everybody gets a 0. Your spelling test was a criterion reference test. It used to be, in criterion reference tests, that you got a raw score. 8 out of 10, 6 out of 10, 60%, 70%. In this system, you don't get a raw score, you get a cut score. It's what score is good enough to be proficient. You don't get the raw numbers. You just get told whether or not little Johnny is proficient, or how close to proficient little Johnny is. And whatever constitutes proficient is called the cut score. You know, you made the cut or you didn't make the cut. Well, is that a good system? This is from the Educational Testing Service. You know, they own the College Board, they do the SAT tests, they do a lot of the tests. And they actually did a whole series. This is their technical manual on how you put together cut scores. And what they said was, well, the job of cut scores is you make the cut scores to increase the likelihood that the score will reflect the goals of your program. That's not the same as telling you how well little Johnny did. The manual went on to say, all cut scores are subjective. There's no objective measure for a cut score. It's all based on what the scoring people think is good. That people who are equally intelligent and equally able will have very different definitions of what constitutes a cut score. There's no way to know whose definition is right or wrong. It's purely a matter of opinion. The document went on to say it's impossible to prove that a cut score is correct. So it is a subjective measurement, and that is all that you're getting. For example, Princeton University did a study and found that in some universities, when children take the SAT, if they're an African American child, the SAT adds 230 points to their score. If they're a Hispanic child, they add 185, but if they're an Asian American child, they subtract 50. Now this surfaced in an article in San Francisco, was where I found it, and then I found it again in Los Angeles, because children were sitting in SAT prep classes, and a lot of those children were Asian American, and the counselor said we kind of have to tell the parents that this is happening, because the goal, remember that you set the cut score to meet your goal, the goal was diversity in admissions in these schools, and the counselor said if we didn't, 3 to 4 out of every 5 admissions would be Asian Americans, and you don't really want that, do you? And of course all the Asian American people said, if our kid earned it, yes we do. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but I bet you didn't know it was there. I bet you didn't know it was happening. Because see, cut scores move. Proficient moves. And since you get no raw data, you have no way of knowing what the score means. Here in New York, when you gave you, this is out of the Journal News, how did you set to the cut scores in New York? What made the cut score? And they actually went back and interviewed the folks. And what they said was there were 95 people who came together. They had to sign confidentiality agreements. They came together after the kids took the test. So they didn't set the standard and then measure the children against the standard. They collected all the raw data. And then they came together to set the standard after the fact. And what they said was, the data is after the fact, the data was confusing, and the standards was given by Pearson. Pearson is the company that your state pays to do the test. They're also the company that produces the remedial material for children who don't pass the test. Remember you heard, follow the money. Mm-hmm. And what they said was, we knew in advance that the scores would be substandard. It was a set system, which is why your proficiency rates dropped so dramatically. Because Common Core was more rigorous. So if it was more rigorous, the children must not be passing. But they were told where to set the standard. The process was manipulated, and the people inside the process told the press, yeah, it was manipulated. When the children take the test, you're a Park State, they can use a calculator starting in 6th grade. And in the English language arts, they can use a spell check. You don't know which children could do the long division problem with or without the calculator. You don't know which children spelled the word correctly the first time or needed to have the spell check, comes up red underneath. Which ones needed it read 16 times before they got it right. You have no way of knowing which children are which. Which means you don't know what that score means. So not only do you not know what the number means, you don't know what task the child did while they were taking the test. Now what does this look like in real life? Here's a 3rd grade classroom. And they've moved from raw score in our spelling test to a cut score system. And this teacher has decided that the most important thing is that children feel very good about their ability to spell. This is a very important thing. I want them to be very confident in their spelling. I don't want them to feel bad about whether they're spelling right or wrong. So I'm setting the cut score at 7 out of 20. And if they get 7 out of 20, they are going to be told that they're proficient. Now remember, you don't know what proficient means in this system, so is that possible? Well, in my state of Pennsylvania, in the Keystone, which is our state assessment, in the Algebra 1 Keystone assessment, in the first section, there were 9 points possible. If you got 3 of them, you were proficient. That's a 33%. I don't know any parents who, when little Johnny came home with a paper that said 33% on it, who would say, "Congratulations, honey, you're proficient." We would use other words. But see, nobody knew it was 33%. They just knew it was proficient. Well, 3 out of 9 and 7 out of 20, that's a third. As a matter of fact, 7 out of 20 is not quite a third. So, little Susie here, she gets 16 out of 20, 80%. She's proficient. Everybody's happy. The next year, little Susie moves into the next grade and the next spelling teacher, and this teacher thinks that the ability to spell correctly is the most important skill that anyone has had since the very beginning of time. Your life will probably end and you'll be a felon if you do not spell every word correctly. So she sets proficient at 18 out of 20. All of a sudden, little Susie is not proficient anymore. Little Susie's achievement hasn't changed, has it? She's still getting 16 out of 20. But last year she was proficient, and this year she's not. But nobody actually knows what her achievement is, because it's a moving target. In fact, all the children from 7 to 18 just changed from proficient to not proficient in 1 year. They're sort of invisible, because nobody actually knows what their achievement is. Oh, well, they would never do that. This is from your state. It's a report card. A teacher in New York just sent it to me last week. Your child has a standards-based report card. Teachers are now asked to tell how your child is doing in relation to standards. Therefore, you get a P if you're proficient. You get an O if you're excelling. You get an A if you're approaching them. And you get a B if you're below them. What does proficient mean? You have no idea. You have no idea. It's whatever the teacher thinks it means that year. Now, interestingly, over on what I did was I took the top and made it bigger. If you go down the inside, number 4 says, your child's mastery on the academic standards will be based on what they demonstrate they know, not on their effort. As if what we used to have was we based it on their effort. That's a lie. Because when you took a spelling test and it said 6 out of 10 or 9 out of 10, that wasn't your effort. That was your achievement. And everybody could look at it and say, this is how many words my kid can spell correctly. Now you don't know that. You have no idea what proficient means. This is about as non-objective a system as one can possibly have. One of the ways that we can see, well, okay, we're doing this, how is it actually working? It's called criterion reference validity, meaning I use my measurement and then compare it to somebody else's measurement. Remember my bathroom scale and then I go to the doctor's scale? So I loved my bathroom scale until I saw the real scale. Okay. So is there a way that we can look at your New York assessments and this system, this standards-based system that has been implemented in America now since the early 1990s, and see, well, how is it doing? Is there a way to measure outside? Yes, there is. The National Assessment, the NAEP, that's a cut score system. But they set their scores in 1992 for reading and 94 for math, and they haven't changed them since. The bar hasn't moved. Your state moves the bar every year. So how do we do? The line at the top is the New York assessment results for 4th grade English. The dots, let's see if I can get my finger to do this. These dots That's the national assessment results over the same time period. Do you notice that New York, wow, look at you, and like almost 80% of your kids, the state was saying we're proficient. But when those same children took the national assessment in reading language arts, only 36% of them were proficient. Well, either you can read at the 4th grade level or you can't read at the 4th grade level. But see, the national assessment, they're not tied to the state of New York. The New York Department of Education, they take New York taxpayer money to implement a curriculum, then they give a test to measure their own progress, and then they report on their own results. And they told everybody, look how well we're doing. When somebody who really didn't care, because the NAEP, they're not tied to you, they just take the test. Their funding doesn't matter. Nothing about the NAEP is tied to the results of the NAEP. They just measure. They don't get any funding, big or little, depending on the results. They're just an outside measure. It's like an outside audit. Why did the number go down? That was the year that Common Core was implemented. And your Commissioner King, before any child took any test, publicly said, oh, this is so much more rigorous. The children's results will be, and he basically predicted the number. Do you really think the children changed that much from one year to another? Or the teachers? Or the curriculum? The only thing that changed was the definition of proficient in the test. And they raised the bar so that more children would fail. And look, Common Core must be working because the results are coming up again. Meanwhile, the NAEP hasn't moved. 4th grade math, basically the same. Sadly, the NAEP is actually coming down. It's interesting, isn't it? The New York assessment is saying, oh, look at how Common Core is working, our results are going up. When those children took the NAEP, the results are even worse. 8th grade, and 8th grade math. And again, you see the same progression. Oh, look how well Common Core is doing. But when they took the NAEP, the results are even worse. So when you have an outside audit, you can see that the system is broken. Well, is it just New York? No. This is from the National Center for Education Statistics. They're an arm of the federal government. If you want to know anything about education, this is part of the department, and they just collect every number on education that you could possibly imagine. This is a graph that they did in 2008. The bar at the top, the brown bar at the top, is the level of achievement that you would have to be considered proficient in the NAEP. The blue bar, this blue bar here, is what the NAEP would consider basic. That's like a C- or a D. Anything below that would be failing the NAEP. The little red dots are where every state defined proficient on their state assessment.